Welcome to WhiskyCast, Cask Strength Conversation, featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 860 for February 28th, 2021. Coming up in a few minutes.
I love California wines. I love California beers. I enjoy other wines too. And if California can make great wines and great beer, I was like, why not make a great single malt in California?
It's not unusual for chemical engineers to start a second career in distilling. But a software engineer? Virag Saksena is one of the founders of 10th Street Distillery in San Jose, California, and went from writing code to making whiskey. I'll talk with him later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. That's coming up along with the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Your Voice, Behind the Label, and
the 2021 Canadian Whisky of the Year.
The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
Hey whiskey fans, I'm Gabriel Cardarella, brand ambassador for the world's most awarded blended Scotch whiskey, Distillers. You could probably guess I've got a lot of stories, but for me, the good ones have one thing in common. They're best told over a glass of whiskey. So hit pause, grab your bottle of Dewars, and let's get back to this episode of WhiskyCast.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Small batch. How would you describe it? It's like an Irishman's understanding of baseball. Extremely limited.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Let's get started with the news. Help is a step closer to reality for struggling U.S. bars, restaurants, and distilleries. Friday night, the House passed President Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID-19 economic relief plan. That includes the $25 billion Restaurant Revitalization Fund, which will make grants available to help the hospitality industry recover from the pandemic's economic impact. Those grants will be available to distilleries, wineries, and breweries with tasting rooms, as well as restaurants and bars. As we have reported before, 9 out of 10 American small-scale distilleries depend on sales at their tasting rooms and distillery shops for a significant part of their revenue. Most of those tasting rooms and shops have been closed in many areas because of local health restrictions. The bill now goes to the Senate for consideration. While there is bipartisan support, the debate over language raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour is an issue for some senators who might otherwise support the rest of the package. Some help is also getting closer for distillers in Kentucky. There, the state house has passed a bill that fixes some of the issues in last year's landmark direct-to-consumer alcohol shipping law. The key change will allow distilleries to use third-party fulfillment centers to handle shipments to consumers. The original law required each distillery to package and ship all mail orders on site. It also fixes other minor issues within the law. While that bill must still be approved by the Kentucky State Senate, it is one of 3 areas where the Kentucky Distillers Association is looking for help from the state to recover from the pandemic's economic impact. Another bill pending in Frankfurt would make cocktails-to-go service at restaurants permanent, and there is discussion about expanding that to bars, distilleries, and wineries. KDA President Eric Gregory is also pushing for passage of a bill that would remove a lot of the in-state restrictions on special single-barrel picks. Right now, they're only available in Kentucky to retailers and restaurants and bars in counties with available package licenses.
You know our good friends like Bill Thomas or Jack Rose in D.C. We have people coming from all over the country to Kentucky to do private barrel selection picks. But in Kentucky, we have a quota system. And so if your package quota is full, then you can't do private barrel selection because you can't sell them by the bottle. And in several communities, that's a problem, including Frankfurt, where, the state capital that has a number of really, great distilleries and KDA headquarters. So a lot of the restaurants there that have really grown, along with bourbon tourism, are asking for that. So it's really, as you know better than anybody, Mark, the bourbon geeks out there like me really like something unique and something even they can call their own. And doing a barrel pick at one of our distilleries, even from the smallest to the largest, is an incredible experience. And I think that's just going to continue to grow as more people really seek out these rare and unique selections.
If that bill passes, here's one example of how it could help. Hotels in Kentucky would be able to have their own special single-barrel bottles available for sale to guests. Scotch whisky industry leaders are also hoping for some help from Westminster this week. Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, will present the British government's new budget to Parliament Wednesday, and the industry is hoping for a reduction in taxes on distilled spirits. Scotch Whisky Association Chief Karen Betts says a tax cut would help make up for some of the damage caused by COVID and the U.S. tariffs on single malts. 2020 was the worst year for Scotch exports in a decade because of the tariffs and global restrictions on travel and public gatherings. We'll have details on the budget announcement at WhiskyCast.com Wednesday and reaction on the next episode of WhiskyCast. Meanwhile, the British government has given new guidance on when pubs and restaurants can start to reopen. Limited outdoor service will not be allowed until at least April 12th, with limited indoor service starting May 17th. If everything is going smoothly, the limits could be lifted completely by June 21st. Most of Scotland's pubs and restaurants will remain closed until at least April 26th for now. However, those in Orkney, Shetland, and other northern islands can open with no alcohol sales allowed. Elsewhere, it'll be another St. Patrick's Day in lockdown for Ireland. The Irish government says current Level 5 lockdown restrictions will remain in place nationwide until at least April 5th. Last year, Ireland's pub lockdown went into effect on March 15th, several days after schools and other businesses were closed. It looks like former UFC champion Conor McGregor is cashing out of the Irish whiskey business. That's according to Beckley, the Beckman family's holding company for its spirits brands. The Mexican-based Beckley originally owned 20% of Ireborn Spirits, the company McGregor and his partners created to launch proper No. 12 Irish whiskey in 2018. Last year, Beckley increased its stake to 49%, and during its fiscal 2020 earnings call with analysts Thursday, the company disclosed that it is exercising its option to buy the rest of Ireborn Spirits. The deal is expected to close later this spring. Beckley did not disclose the purchase price. Last year's deal valued Ireborn Spirits at around $235 million, and proper No. 12 sales have continued to show strong growth since then. It is not known whether Conor McGregor will have an ongoing role with the brand after the sale. A Beckley spokesman told us in an email that more details will be announced after the deal is closed, and proper No. 12's U.S. Public Relations Agency has not responded to our requests for comment. Normally, the winners of the Canadian Whisky Awards would be announced in January during the annual Victoria Whisky Festival, but the past year, as we all know, has been anything but normal. Instead, founder Davin DeCurgamo announced the winners during a live webcast Thursday night.
The Connoisseur Whiskey of the Year in the domestic market, also the best blended whiskey, and the 2021 Canadian Whisky of the Year. And this, believe me, was just by fractions of a point, but the Canadian Whisky of the Year is Canadian Club 43-Year-Old Chronicles, the Speakeasy. People just love, the judges just love that whiskey.
Canadian Club's blending team also took home Blender of the Year honors, while Hiram Walker Distillery in Windsor, Ontario, was named Distillery of the Year. Divine Distillery and Winery in Saanich, British Columbia, was named Artisanal Distillery of the Year, while retiring Divine co-founder Ken Winchester was presented with the Lifetime Achievement Award for his work. There's a link to the complete list of award winners in the show notes for this episode at WhiskyCast.com, And Tish Harkis of Canadian Club was not available for an interview in time for this week's podcast. We will hear from her next time around. Full disclosure, I have served as a judge for the Canadian Whisky Awards every year until this one. Travel restrictions caused by the pandemic made it impossible for me to get the judging samples this year. Last time around, we reported on Japan's new standards defining what Japanese whiskey is and what it is not. Now, all of New Zealand's 19 whiskey distillers have agreed on their own standards for what can be called New Zealand whiskey. Distilled Spirits Aotearoa unveiled the standards this week, and they largely mirror Scotland's standards for whiskey, with two exceptions: a 2-year minimum maturation period instead of 3 years, and no specific requirement that whiskey be matured in oak casks. Tosh McGill of the DSA says that's to allow distillers the freedom to experiment with native New Zealand woods.
New Zealand is, originally, at least the original European migrants here were largely European, and an enormous number actually came from Scotland and Ireland and England. And so it would only be fitting to kind of pay tribute and heritage to that tradition. A lot of the whiskey that's being made here is actually being made in a traditional Scots sort of style. But we also needed to create some room within that and to recognise the fact that we are in fact a New World whiskey. That's our classification, and there's really no two ways going about it when you come from a country that's only really been formally known for about 180 years or so.
There are also specific requirements to protect the heritage and culture of New Zealand's original inhabitants, the Tamori. While the standards are voluntary, there is widespread support for turning them into legislation. We'll have much more on this story and the growth of New Zealand's whiskey industry next time around. One job note of change this week: Stephen Woodcock has stepped down as master distiller for Distell's Deanston, Bunnahabhain, and Tobermory distilleries in Scotland. He took over in early 2016 after Ian McMillan left for Bladnoch and oversaw production at all 3 distilleries. Stephen has not disclosed his future plans, but hinted on social media this week that he will be staying in the Fife area and staying in the whiskey industry. Finally, we want to send out our best wishes to our pal Louise McGuane of Chapelgate Whisky Company in Ireland. Chapelgate is located on her family's farm in County Clare along the Atlantic coast, and it is a real farm, complete with critters. One of those critters, whom Louise affectionately refers to as JJ the Wonder Horse, stomped on her right foot the other day, leaving Louise on crutches and in a cast for the next few weeks with a broken foot. JJ's going to be fine, though. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all the week long at WhiskyCast.com. Friday night, my guests on our live happy hour webcast were Middleton Master Distiller Kevin O'Gorman and Stuart Buchanan of Benriach and Glendronach Distilleries. You can catch the on-demand replay of the webcast, along with all of our previous live webcasts from the past 11 months, on the WhiskyCast YouTube channel. This Friday night, I'll be joined by Uncle Nearest Tennessee whiskey founder Fawn Weaver and master blender Victoria Edie Butler. Victoria was named Master Blender/Distiller of the Year earlier this month in Whiskey Magazine's Icons of Whiskey America Awards, and she's a direct descendant of Uncle Nearest's namesake, Nathan Nearest Green. That's coming up this Friday at 5 p.m. New York time, 2200 GMT, on the WhiskyCast YouTube channel, our Facebook page, Twitter, and while it lasts, Periscope. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events, brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling. Bonhams has its next whiskey auction this Tuesday in Edinburgh, Scotland. There is still time to sign up for the Men's Journal magazine Dewar's virtual tasting with Gabe Cardarella and Chef George Mendez on Wednesday. Bourbon's Bistro in Louisville, Kentucky is hosting a Jefferson's Bourbon Dinner on March 11th. Keeling Whiskey Company in Dublin has a virtual St. Patrick's Day Masterclass March 12th, and Chapelgate Whiskey Company has a virtual St. Patrick's Day event on the 14th. McTears has its next whiskey auction on March 26th in Glasgow, Scotland, and the Fredericksburg Whiskey and Wine Fest takes place on the 27th in Fredericksburg, Texas. That'll be followed by the Galleria Whiskey and Wine Festival in Houston, April 3rd, the Whiskey Obsession Festival in Tampa, Florida, April 8th, and at Glassfestivalen, the One Glass Festival, in Oslo, Norway, April 16th and 17th. Of course, all of those in-person events remain subject to change on short notice, depending on public health restrictions. So, make sure you check with event organizers before you make any travel plans. We are updating the calendar at WhiskyCast.com throughout the week as we get updates on event changes. The calendar of events is brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of the Virginia Rye Whiskey. You'll find their Roundstone Rye at fine whiskey shops in 26 U.S. states, 3 continents, and online. Visit the Where to Buy page at CatoctinCreekDistilling.com to find a retailer near you. And please drink responsibly.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast. Trying to fit the best of Ireland into one day, huh? Good luck. Takes us at least 12 years.
Happy St. Patrick's Day from Redbreast, proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by the Distillers Edition collection. The boom in craft distilling has brought all kinds of people into the whiskey business. For instance, Virag Saksena was a software engineer and an executive at Oracle, along with being a whiskey lover. He and his partner Vishal Nauri, who happens to be a chemical engineer by trade, opened their 10th Street Distillery in San Jose, California in 2017. Now, when you think of California distilleries, you might have a picture in your mind of something like the wineries in Napa Valley. But 10th Street Distillery is in an industrial park on the south side of San Jose, right in the heart of Silicon Valley. And they took a technology-oriented approach to making their whiskeys after doing some homework first.
Often what happens is that when you don't know what you don't know, you just follow your passion. And one of the things which happened with me, this was in 2008 or so, we ran out of a single malt which I really loved. And this was a Lafroig 30-year-old aged in sherry butts. Price at that time was $250, which, if you look at it now, you'll say, hey, 30-year-old for that price, that's amazing. But it was great whiskey, and you couldn't find it anymore. So I went about trying to figure out why you couldn't get it anymore. Turned out it was a special release. Somebody had bought fresh make from Lafroig, aged it in sherry butts. 30 years later, when they died, the estate sold it back to Lafroig, and they bottled it. It was an amazing whiskey, and for the first time in my life at that time, I felt a sense of loss. Understanding my grief, a fellow single malt enthusiast introduced me in 2009 to a Ardbeg Alinam Beast. Again, a wonderful whiskey. It said on that 1990 special edition. Obviously, that doesn't mean, as I thought, that it was distilled in 1990. Well, guess what? This whiskey was distilled in 1990. And by 2010, that whiskey was out too. And that got me really upset because you enjoy a spirit and then it just disappears. And I love California wines. I love California beers. I enjoy other wines too. And if California can make great wines and great beer, I was like, why not make a great single malt in California? At that time, I had tasted Amrit in 2010 or 2011. So I was like, wow, India is making single malts like this. It never made those when I lived in India, right? We had Yamazaki. So like everyone is making great single malts. Why don't we do the same thing here? I'd been making beer at that time, for about 15 to 20 years at home. So you could say I knew the first part of making whiskey, though later on I realized that wasn't true. But basically that pushed us down this rabbit hole.
But it's a long way from making beer at home to running a distillery.
Absolutely.
Tell me about the journey.
So what happened was, I knew how to make, I would say, decent beer. My friends loved it, but then they weren't paying for it. So it's like, if it wasn't good, they would love it. So my next thing was to figure out, I knew nothing about making whiskey. I did not know if a good beer makes a good whiskey or a bad beer makes a bad whiskey. And you could always troll around on the internet and there would be different people saying different things. But that doesn't really tell you what exactly you need to do to make good whiskey, consistently good whiskey, same. So once you have crafted a good whiskey, what we wanted to make sure was people love a whiskey. They come back 2 months later to buy another bottle. It should taste the same. It should not taste different. And for us, craft did not mean inconsistency. Craft meant we could achieve a higher level of quality, what somebody else can do in a mass production environment, because we don't have to cut the corners over there simply for the bottom line, right? Our whole point is to create a great premium product, and that's what you can do at a smaller scale. So the first thing I wanted to do was to figure out how to make a good whiskey, and my first love has been peated single malts. So I decided to go to Islay to learn from the masters how the things are done in the old way, classic way. And I found an apprenticeship in Islay. So I went there, spent some time working over there, because I was working at a distillery, I got to do these deep dives at other distilleries like, Ardbeg and Lefroy. So I could understand what was different, what were they doing differently, what were they doing same. And the most important thing which I learned was, whenever you're making something, you know what the final product tastes like. You don't know what the initial stages taste like. And what does the wash smell and taste like, right? What does the fresh make smell and taste like? What does it taste like when it's aging after 6 months? It's basically about learning the craft, right? It's learning the craft, not having done that. I knew what the beer is, but it wasn't. And so it was interesting where I learned, how the wash is very different from the beer you make. And later on, when I came back and analyzed, I understood why is it that the wash which you make, what is called distiller's beer, is not what you would often drink as a beer. And there are these different things. A mouthfeel of a beer is from residual sugars. Well, those will not make it across in distillation. So your mashing protocol and your fermentation protocol are all different. So you end up having a much thinner beer which won't have that mouthfeel, which will actually make great whiskey. You also use a different yeast, which creates a whole bunch of different flavor profiles. It does not flocculate and fall to the bottom. You would distill with the yeast on it. So what we do a whole bunch of stuff is we let it sit around and get infected by the local sourdough yeast, the microflora, which gives it a nice sour, tart flavor, which are things which we have done differently from Scotland. So understanding those things was a key thing. This was in 2011. And then I came back and I decided to figure out how we would craft a whiskey which was not a copy of a Scotch, but it was our own expression of a single malt in the unique climate which we live here in California. And so to that end, we have released a bunch of different whiskeys. The final one, as you know, is the California Coast Blend, which for us represents a lot of what California is all about. It's an easygoing whiskey, makes a great highball, it's a great blend, or great sipping just by itself. It kind of like embodies the culture of California. It combines a whole bunch of different whiskeys, just like you can see, California, you will see people from all over the country. So the first whiskey which we crafted was a peated single malt. There were two reasons for that. One was I was passionate about peated single malts, and we couldn't really find a lot of great peated single malts coming out of America. We ended up bringing in grain from Scotland because we couldn't source a peated grain here. We ended up getting a custom peated grain, so it will work well with the hard water we have in San Jose. So this is just like the old times. As you know, when people made beer, some places had hard water, and they were known for making great dark beers like porters and stouts. And other places had soft water, and those regions were known for making lagers and pilsners. Now what has happened is people will create the mineral profile of Munich or Newcastle to create that kind of beer. We went back saying, okay, we have a hard water, so let's get a grain, we know that will work well with peated grain, but let's get a peat level so we can actually make a great whiskey without having to change the water around. Peated grain is also, peated malt is hard to make because you need to figure out how to get the peat to come out without getting a bunch of undesirable flavors in your whiskey. You don't want burnt ash, creosote notes in there. You want those smoky, earthy, honey, those kind of notes in there. And that's what a peated single malt is like. It's got a lot of floral, heathery notes. Anyway, so let me step back a little bit. So what ended up happening then was the other thing which I didn't want to do was I didn't want to spend 20 years aging my whiskey. So what do we need to do? And there's a whole bunch of these things you hear about, somebody ages whiskey in a day or 2 days. And I'm like, is there any truth to that? So anyway, I got a small copper pot still, right? You can't legally own a copper pot still for distilling alcohol unless you have a permit, which I did not. And with this little 5-gallon still, which I used for distilling water, I was trying to figure out how to make a great whiskey. So we went through a whole bunch of things, and what we found was it was actually a combination of the things. Meaning it's not that you put a whiskey in a small barrel and accelerate the aging process, which makes a whiskey too woody, right? It loses that balance. It's about what actually is going into the cask, how it was distilled, how it was fermented, how it was mashed. So all of those things work together and interact with each other, and you have to create this whole, look at each thing, system as a whole, rather than looking at and tune each of those parts. And it took us about 5 years of experimentation to do that, from 2011 to 2016. We're basically running these batches with peated grain, with unpeated grain, different fermentation yeast, different fermentation protocols, different mashing protocols, different distillation cuts, until we found that we had a fresh make which we thought would age well, meaning we didn't have barrels, so it was approximating that, taking the same wood to surface area ratio as a bigger barrel, until we found what we thought was the right set of two whiskeys. And then in 2016, we said, let's go find a place and let's start distilling.
I'm curious about your use of STR casks. Did you have the chance to work with Dr. Jim Swan, who pioneered that process?
We did not. I wish we could have, but by the time we were starting the distillery, he had passed away. So, but his STR casks were reused wine casks. We, on the other hand, are reusing the bourbon casks. So it's slightly different. But it's the same concept which he had pioneered. And the reason we are using STR casks is because for the second whiskey, as we wanted to create something which was closer to an American whiskey, we wanted it to remind people of a bourbon. But at the same time, we did not want it to be too woody. What we found was that if you use fresh wooden casks, the wood tended to overpower the flavor profile of the malt. We wanted to be so if you taste a peated single malt, you will find the peat is not in your face. You can definitely tell it's a peaty whiskey, but you have the peat and the wood all fairly balanced together. When we were making STR, which is an unpeated whiskey, we wanted to kick up the wood a little bit because the peat was gone and we wanted to take its place, but we didn't want the wood to dominate. And so if we use the used wooden cask, we are getting less of that wood. So what we decided to do was take a used wooden cask and use the STR technique, and that kicked up wood just a little bit, that you get some of you're reminded of bourbon, but you know you're drinking a single malt.
How did you scale up your production from that little test still that you were using before you opened your distillery to the big industrial process that you have now?
Yeah. So I was lucky enough that my partner is a chemical engineer. He's a PhD in chemical engineering. And I guess the holy grail for all chemical engineers is to distill alcohol. So when he heard about this project, and we were both fellow whiskey enthusiasts, he was, it was his dream too to come and jump in on that process. He used to set up plants for GE after he finished his PhD. He had been stolen by the dark side of technology, and he was very happy to come back and do this. So I don't think I would have gotten it up and running in the time I did without his help.
And what was your background before you got into this? I know you're an engineer, but what kind of engineering work were you doing?
So my background in engineering is basically software engineering. It's about performance tuning, large enterprise systems, right? When sometimes when you're sitting on a website and that wheel is spinning away and you wonder what's going on, my job was to make that go faster. So that's what we used to do. And in essence, we ended up doing kind of like that for whiskey, which is how do you age a whiskey in a year to 2 years versus 10 to 20 years.
But you still had to slow it down. because, or at least slow your expectations down, because websites work in terms of seconds or nanoseconds. Whiskey works in terms of years. So you had to learn to slow those expectations down a bit, right?
Absolutely. And that was the most frustrating part in the beginning. So what happens is when you're solving a software issue, right, you'll go in, you'll make a change, you'll see the results immediately, right? You'll see what's happening. So if something is when, we would go into fix problems, where people would have put pictures of pigs with words, pigs don't fly. And you're like, oh, let me go get a cup of coffee after I hit this key. And within a day, you would fix the problems. And when we started doing the whiskey, it was fairly interesting because you won't see any signal for a couple of weeks. So you make something, you sit it down, let it age, and then you come back after a couple of weeks, which is why it didn't take us a day or 2 days or 3 days to figure it out. It took us about 5 years of, running batches every week or so. And then sitting, initially, you would run a batch every day. Then you realize there's no point in running a batch every day because as you're documenting your experiments, you're not going to see any signal for weeks and sometimes till months. And so it was the slow process we will see. So when we started the distillery, our expectation was it will take us somewhere around 6 months to a year to be able to age a whiskey. It ended up being a year rather than 6 months. And when people asked us, how long are you going to age your whiskey? Our answer was as long as it takes. We have done all the right work. Now it's going to go into the barrels, right? And the angels are going to take their share. And we'll find out when it's ready. So it takes us about a year to age a whiskey over here. And one of the big boosts we get over Scotland is the weather. It's much hotter and the temperature accelerates all of those reactions. I was concerned if some other reactions might start happening which might make the whiskey rougher. Knock on wood, that did not happen. The angels, because of that heat, are really greedy. So you lose 2 to 3% a year. In Scotland, here we lose 10 to 15%.
And you have a much different climate than San Francisco, 50 miles to the north, which tends to get very cool and rainy at times during the summer. But on the other side of the mountains where you guys are, it tends to be hot most of the year, right?
It is. It does get cold in the winter. So right now it is cold. Not as cold as it was in Illinois, where I was about a week ago. But it does get cold over here. It's really hot. It's in the 90s all the time during the summer. And that makes meaning it's impossible for us with that 10 to 15% rate to age a whiskey more than 5 years. In fact, we probably need to find a cooler microclimate around where we could actually put a whiskey and let it age.
So where do you take it from here? What's the goal? American single malt is becoming more and more well-known and popular in the U.S. right now, and you guys are on the crest of it. Where do you take your whiskey from here?
Our objective is to create great whiskey. So somebody is drinking a single malt, and it's not just a single malt. It's also what we realize is it's a class of whiskeys, right? So America has always been known for great bourbons, great ryes. The original American whiskey was rye, right? When George Washington was making a whiskey, he was making a rye on Mount Vernon. But it's about what do we need to do for our single malts and also to craft great blends. So David Perkins was the first master of blends in America. He was blending American whiskeys to create amazing blends. And we are hoping to continue that kind of tradition where we can craft not just single malts, but also blends to create unique flavor profiles which people can enjoy. And American single malts don't have to be something which is made like a Scotch. So even though we looked at those techniques, some of the things we are doing is we are doing a port cask finish. We are picking up local wine casks from the local vintners, which we are using to create expressions which reflect more some of our local terroir. I think it's all about the American spirit of freedom, where you're crafting, as long as you're crafting a great product, it doesn't have to be typecast as being a certain way.
The first of those wine cask releases is a peated single malt finished in a local Pinot Noir cask. And Virag Saksena also mentioned their California Coast blended whiskey. Like many things in California, it has its roots in the Midwest. It's a blend of their two main single malts, the peated Distillers cut and the non-peated STR cask, with two pot still light whiskeys from MGP in Indiana. Light whiskeys are distilled to a higher proof and can be compared in many ways to the grain whiskeys used in Scotland for blending purposes. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth. It's brought to you by the Distillers Edition collection lineup of single malts from Diageo's Classic Malts. Look for the new 2020 editions of Oban, Talisker, Lagavulin, Cragganmore, Dalwhinnie, and Glenkinchie at a whiskey shop near you. And get all the details at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Let's start with that California Coast blend from 10th Street Distillery. I received a sample this week. It's bottled at 42% ABV, and the nose is light and fruity with touches of peaches, apricots, cocoa, and hints of vanilla, beach sand, and driftwood. The taste has a tart balance of citrus fruits with campfire smoke and hints of dried flowers and honey. The finish? It's long and sugary sweet with just a touch of citrus. I'm scoring the 10th Street Distillery California Coast Blended Whiskey an 89. One of the component whiskeys in that blend is the 10th Street Distillers Cut Peated Single Malt. It's bottled at 44% ABV and is made with peated Scottish barley and matured in ex-bourbon barrels. The nose on this one has notes of grilled fruits, brown sugar, and a nice smokiness, along with a hint of charred oak. The taste has a good balance of peat smoke, fresh berries, honey, dark chocolate, and a hint of barley sugar. The finish? Long, smoky, and well-balanced. I'm scoring the 10th Street Distillery Distillers Cut a 91. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. Want to find out how Sagamore Spirit is reviving the tradition of Maryland-style rye whiskey? Well, in-person tastings are available once again at the distillery in Baltimore, but you'll also find a variety of virtual tours, tastings, and other experiences at the Sagamore Spirit website. They're offering WhiskyCast listeners a free virtual guided tasting. Purchase bottles from your local retailer, and a Sagamore Spirit teammate will guide you through each product. Visit SagamoreSpirit.com and use the code WhiskyCast, all one word, to access. Please drink responsibly. One of the gold medal winners in this week's Canadian Whisky Awards was the 2020 edition of Alberta Premium Cask Strength Rye. This one comes in at 66% ABV. The nose has notes of toasted caramel, subtle spices, and hints of oak and vanilla. The taste? Spicy and intense with black pepper, clove, and cinnamon notes that stick to the tongue and last for a while, along with honey, vanilla, and toasted caramel in the background. The finish? Long and spicy. It's a whopper of a whiskey, and I'm scoring the 2020 edition of Alberta Premium Cask Strength Rye a 93. Finally, the Whiskey Fairy, or was it Robin, delivered a bottle of the new Redbreast Small Batch this week. It's a U.S. exclusive, bottled at 58.9% ABV. The nose has touches of fig cookies and citrus fruits, complemented by baking spices, honey, and vanilla. The taste is thick and fruity, with notes of clove, allspice, white pepper, and a hint of cinnamon, while touches of oak and dark chocolate in the background pull it all together. The finish is long and spicy, with a nice balance of fruity character. I'm already trying to track down a second bottle of this one. I'm scoring the Redbreast Cask Strength Batch B119 a 94. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I'll be adding these whiskeys to our searchable list of nearly 3,100 whiskeys from all over the world. You'll find it at whiskycast.com. Check it out this week.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Gabriel Cardarella again, the Doers Guy. I've seen a lot in my years as brand ambassador for the world's most awarded blended scotch. Like the time I got a hold of an actual letter written by Andrew Carnegie, a letter from 1891, in it asking Doers to ship a keg of whiskey to President Benjamin Harrison at the White House. Spoiler alert, we did. And the bourbon folks were not too happy about it. Pretty cool, right? Well, here's another story for you. In 2019, our master blender, Stephanie Mcleod, became the first woman to be awarded Master Blender of the Year by the International Whiskey Competition. And a year after that, she won it again. Stephanie's first creation for Dewar's 15 year, is another piece of history. Sweet, floral, with notes of honey and toffee, a perfectly balanced addition to the Dewar's lineup. It's a great introduction to Scotch for beginners, and it's more than complex enough to satisfy whiskey aficionados. So grab some Dewar's 15, call some friends, and make a few stories of your own. That's what a good bottle of whiskey is all about.
Let's open up the inbox now for your voice. Last fall, we heard from Tapiwa Carlton Chikwineri in Harare, Zimbabwe. He was trying to find Glencairn glasses in Zimbabwe, and I sent him a couple of our WhiskyCast Glencairns. He emailed this question the other day. First time trying out bourbon whiskey. The market is mainly dominated by Scotch whiskies, and recently Irish whiskies are taking ground. I heard someone saying Four Roses is a, quote, traditional bourbon. Is there a new style bourbon and traditional way of making bourbon? Thanks. Okay, this is a good Bourbon 101 question, and it's worth answering because I know you're not the only person that's asked this question, Tapiwa. Remember that bourbon makers will often use either rye or wheat as the flavoring grain in their mash bills. That's because corn doesn't have much flavor on its own. Most distillers use rye, including Four Roses, so that's why you'd hear references to it as a traditional bourbon, although that's not a term you'd usually hear in Kentucky. Since most bourbons are made with rye, you would probably hear more references to wheated bourbons instead, or four-grain bourbons that use both wheat and rye. Rye is just that commonplace in Kentucky bourbons. I hope that answers your question, Tapiwa, and please keep in touch. Last week's segment on the new Japanese whiskey standards seems to have struck a nerve. I heard from the Irish Distillers Association this week, and don't confuse it with the Irish Whiskey Association. The Irish Distillers Association, as it claims on its Twitter bio, represents small-scale distillers who sell only the products of their own pot stills. Here's the tweet the association sent. Hi, Mark. If Japan can improve, so can Ireland. Label info, including indicated place of provenance, must not mislead the whiskey purchaser. Awareness in wider industry of the Irish problem. If Irish authorities won't enforce regs, EU will. Okay, the gripe is over brands that use Irish place names, but are bottling sourced whiskey that doesn't actually come from the place indicated on the label. While some of those brands may actually be distilling their own whiskey now at those places, it may not be old enough to be bottled yet. And the Irish Distillers Association's position is that that does not matter. The IDA is calling it a reputational threat to Irish whiskey's geographical indicator status. That is a dispute I am not about to wade into. You guys sort that one out. Just let me know when you get it all worked out, okay? If there's something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Let's wrap up the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and other things that make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. During the peak of the recent winter storms, At the Rain Line tweeted this question from Georgia. What's your take on drinking whiskey to keep warm? Makes sense on its face, but heard it may not actually help long term. At the time, my brief answer was that alcohol causes you to feel warm briefly by dilating the blood vessels, but that it can cause more problems than it solves. I had a longer explanation, but remember, I am not a doctor, so I wanted to do some checking first with real doctors to make sure that my explanation was solid. So, here's what happens when your body gets cold, and we'll use the analogy of the cooling system in a car. Think of your skin as the radiator. When you get hot, Blood flow increases to your skin, and the evaporation caused by perspiring helps cool the blood as it returns to your body's core. On the other hand, when you get cold, your body's internal thermostat is designed to protect the vital core organs, your heart, lungs, brain, and other internal organs. The brain automatically tells the blood vessels in your extremities to constrict. That reduces the blood flow and helps hold in the heat in your body's core. I hate to put it in these terms, but your body is actually trying to protect itself. Your hands and feet are expendable compared to the organs that keep you alive. Now, when you take a drink of whiskey, the alcohol is what's called a vasodilator. It essentially short-circuits your brain's instructions and causes the blood vessels in your extremities to relax. That increases the flow of warm blood to your legs, arms, and skin, and you start to feel warmer. The problem is you've actually taken the body heat from your core and moved it back out to parts of your body where the skin allows the heat to radiate off of your body, and you wind up even colder than before. I mentioned that your body is programmed to protect the brain against cold. That's one of the reasons why your cheeks might appear flushed, as your body keeps the blood flow going to your head. Of course, wearing a hat helps hold that heat in to keep you warm. Here's a bonus explainer on why alcohol can cause even more problems in cold weather. If you've ever put a bottle of whiskey in a freezer, you probably have noticed that the liquid doesn't freeze solid, even though as much as 60% of that liquid is water in a 40% ABV bottle of whiskey. That's because the alcohol-water solution has a much lower freezing point than plain water. So if you're carrying a stainless steel flask full of whiskey in cold weather, the temperature of that whiskey can actually drop to a point where it's unsafe to drink from that flask. I've mentioned before that we used to live in Alaska, where I worked as a reporter for the NBC station in Anchorage. One winter we had a story about 2 hunters in rural Alaska who literally died from drinking out of a flask. I gotta be honest, I don't remember whether it was vodka or whiskey, but the liquid was so cold in that flask that it froze the tissue in the throat and esophagus in seconds, and the hunters never had a chance. I mention the need for responsible drinking on every episode of WhiskyCast, and sometimes being responsible means knowing when to steer clear of alcohol. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot. The tears of Ireland's great writers bursting with flavour, humour and angst. Bottled for you to taste. No writers were harmed in the making of this premium Irish whiskey. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and of course a complete archive of past episodes going all the way back to 2005. Don't forget to join us next time around when we'll name March's Whiskey Club of the Month. We love to hear from you. You can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Ever go out drinking with a peacock? Always the same. Few too many, tail feathers come out, drinks get knocked over, bartender's not happy, night's over before it started. All I'm saying is, don't be the peacock in your group.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
At Doers, we love a good story, and that's why we're always writing new chapters. Like our Illegal Smooth finished in mezcal casks. With notes of sliced green pepper and a wisp of smoke, a world's first, Illegal brings cultures together for something truly unique. As a 174-year-old brand, we could rest on our laurels. Instead, we'd much rather continue writing. Because when you keep telling the same old story, that's when people stop listening.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2021, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening, and please stay safe.